Hello, welcome to everyone who's joining us both here in person and those of us who are online. I'm very happy to welcome you today to this panel, our first event of day 2 of the Basel Peace Forum, Navigating Fact and Fiction, How to Fight Fake News. As Laurent said, I'm Emma Baumhofer. I work at Swiss Peace as the Digital Peace Building Advisor, and I get to moderate this very interesting session today with 3 experts. I have 1 joining me here in person and 2 virtually, who I will introduce momentarily. But first, the topic of fake news is a big one, so let's see what we can get through in a little over an hour. But it's also pervasive. It cuts across contexts and geographies. And it's not a new problem. It's something that we've known before, maybe as rumors or as propaganda. And it often includes coordinated efforts by powerful groups or governments. But despite some familiarity, there's certainly something about the present day fake news environment that feels particularly pressing. So that's what we're going to look at today. And of course, fake news is not a digital problem. It is actually, fake news thrives when it can go between online and offline channels, which makes it very difficult to understand where the fake news is coming from. But digital technology certainly does play a big role in providing tools that can manipulate content or that can amplify and rapidly spread unverified information. So on the one hand, we have a proliferation of information, and it can be very difficult for people to understand with all the information what is trustworthy and what isn't. And then on the other side, we have increasing surveillance, we have lopsided content moderation, and in some places, internet shutdowns. And this creates a void where some dissenting voices to misinformation or fake news narratives are silenced or might self-censor for reasons of safety. We're facing things like deepfakes, malinformation environments that threaten democracies, and flawed AI, to name just a few. And that's why I'm very happy to be joined here by 3 experts who can help us better understand these challenges and also, I hope, provide some ideas about how we can better combat them. So I'm going to introduce all 3 at the beginning. I've asked them to prepare some intro remarks to their work on this topic. We'll have a panel, and then we'll be opening it up to questions, so start thinking of them now or putting them in the chat if you are joining us online. So the first expert that I'm very happy to introduce you to today is Professor Danielle Citron. She's one of the experts joining us online, and she is Professor of Law at the University of Virginia in the US, where she writes and teaches about privacy, free expression, and civil rights. She works with lawmakers, law enforcement, and tech companies to combat online abuse. In 2019, she testified before Congress about the national security and privacy risks of deepfakes. Professor Citron is also the vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, a nonprofit devoted to fighting for civil rights and liberties in the digital age. Welcome, Danielle. And next, you will hear from Ms. Idayat Hassan, she is also a lawyer, and she is the director of the Center for Democracy and Development, which is an Abuja-based policy advocacy and research organization that focuses on deepening democracy and development in West Africa. Her interests span democracy, peace and security, transitional justice, and information and communications technology. And her portfolio includes analyzing the nexus between social media platforms, election processes, and electoral outcomes. Welcome, Idayat. And finally, my expert who's here with me on the stage here in Basel, I have Ms. Branka. She is a political scientist, expert in international security, international development policy, and peace building, and is currently focused on researching the utilization of data-driven approaches to peace building and the ethical implications of exponential technologies. Branka is the founder and executive director of AI for Peace and co-founder of the Center for Exponential Technologies, Connecting Policy and the Tech World. Welcome, Branka.
Thank you.
So with that, I'll hand over to Danielle for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much for having me. I wish I was with all of you in person. There was just nothing like the real thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit in my 5 minutes about deepfakes and its impact on sort of both truth and trust. So let me just, we often, in the most recent political cycles, we've long talked about how we're worried about the use of digitally manipulated video and audio to show candidates doing and saying things that they never did or said. And that threat hasn't quite materialized, but where we have seen deep fakes are in ways that both can destroy people's lives and silence them. In particular, we've seen it with journalists. Journalists who have been critics of regimes, and I'm going to use the case of Rana Ayub, a journalist in India who has been a longtime critic of the Modi regime and who exposes human rights abuses. And in 2018, she's sitting at her with a friend at a cafe, and her phone starts exploding. And a source from inside the Modi government said, check your phone, which was inevitable she was going to. It was like the phone was blowing up with tweets, and a video of her showing her engaged in a sex act had gone viral. And within 48 hours, it was on half of the phones in India. And so what then ensued in both on her Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, were death and rape threats, doxing, so the publication of her home address. And what the Modi regime clearly wanted was to silence her. And it got what it wanted. For about 6 months, Rana went offline, and she basically hid in her home. And as she explained to me, it felt like there were millions of eyes on her body, so that she experienced what happened to her as a deep invasion of her intimate privacy, but also deeply threatening and frightening. And so deep fakes, of course, can then what happens is when people go offline and they self-censor and they're silenced, it undermines both, of course, trust in the marketplace of ideas. Can we believe what our eyes and ears are telling us? But inevitably also, besides just undermining our sense of truth, it also decays our sense of trust. And my co-author, Bobby Chesney, and I have written about what we call the Liars Dividend, which is what's so great about deep fakes, that is digitally manipulated audio and video, that is very hard even for technologists to distinguish whether it's real or not, is that liars, criminals, scofflaws, can look at audio and video of them, realistic video of them, doing and saying things they've actually done or said, and say, well, come on, you can't believe your eyes and ears. Can't believe anything these days. That's fake news. And we have seen politicians engage in and gamble on the liar's dividend. So President Trump, the Access Hollywood video comes out. He says, I'm really sorry, I apologize. I didn't mean to have that kind of locker room talk. But a year later, when he was then president, says, that wasn't really me on the audio. He's sort of like testing out the liar's dividend. And I think what is most concerning to my colleague Bobby Chesney and I, not only is our sense of inability to trust what we see and that we're going to believe the fakery, but also that ultimately that what we see in here, which is so important for human rights, right, to show suffering, right, to be a witness, that is when folks, they just don't believe audio and video, that will ultimately have deep and disabling trust decay. So I think I'll stop there. I really look forward to talking about deepfakes and the ways in which we have a really decayed trust and truth in the marketplace of ideas, and what we can do about it. I know Anna's going to ask us about questions for our co-panelists, but I think I'll wait on that and hand over the mic.
Great, thank you, Danielle. I love that concept of the liar's dividend, actually. That's a good one. Idayat, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll just give a brief overview of disinformation and touch on some very important aspects of it, particularly how it takes place in Nigeria and broadly in West Africa. So for us, as Helia said, disinformation is not a new phenomenon. In fact, previously disinformation peddlers were called radio without battery. And it was previously even used during the Nigerian Civil War, where today in Southeast Nigeria, propagandists or disinformation peddlers are referred to as okokondem, particularly because they use their personal influence to spread disinformation. But what has actually happened in this last couple of years is that social media has actually expanded the bandwidth of the radio without battery with extensive reach, speed, and lower cost. So for instance, if you take a WhatsApp forward, even at the limit of 5, you can in few minutes share information to 1,280 persons at the maximum of that 256 persons per group. And in countries like Nigeria with very low internet connection subscription rates, that will cost you just 25 cents to subscribe for WhatsApp just for 1 month. And within minutes, you can also see posts on Twitter or Facebook shared by followers. This is aside cross-platform sharing. So what it does at the end of the day is that it makes people, it's actually driving division and polarizing the continent. But it doesn't actually work. It doesn't work just like in a vacuum, as said earlier, particularly in terms of emotions. But so it builds on pre-existing narrative and a context driven by people's reality and emotions, particularly in countries where there are lots of polarization, either along ethnic or religious lines, and democracy itself has refused to deliver the dividend to the people. So it becomes very easy to actually believe most of these issues. And one very good example will be to look at Twitter handles, for instance, which actually tweets in support of the independent people of Biafra. And what this Twitter handle does is when at the CDD we collated over 33 million tweets ahead of the 2019 general elections. First and foremost, this collation actually showed 19.5% rates of automation. And a particular bot, Nwamba Raphael, is actually tweeting at 13,000 tweets per day. And this handle only helps spread anti-Nigerian, anti-Fulani sentiments while propagating pro-Igbo sentiments, particularly going back to the history of Nigeria and the 1967 to 1970 Civil War. So this is just one out of several examples. Now, while deepfakes are a very, very big thing, it's often just used in elections in Nigeria. But importantly is the empowering role. Both empowering and destructive roles videos can actually take. One, you could actually use videos to micro-target a particular ethnic group during elections. Old videos can easily come back with new captions. And in 55 seconds, it can actually convey a message that even 1 hour treatise with very good audio visual could not actually achieve. And this also has significant world events, which I make reference to a conflict that broke out in the north central states of Plateau in 2018. And the BBC did an in-depth review into this conflict. And what did it show? A video emerged showing mutilated bodies, decapitated children, and lots of houses burnt. And of course, the ongoing was a minor skirmish between the Fulani Muslims and the Birom Christians. With this video surfacing, 11 extra people died at the end of the conflict. A review of the video actually showed that video was made in 2012, and it was a video from the Democratic Republic of Congo. But see what it has actually done in Nigeria itself. And because of disinformation, it's led to a lot of suppression of rights, self-censorship, as we've talked about, and even government focusing on regulations. So across West Africa, an average of 8 countries are attempting to actually write new legislations, while some do have existing legislations or newly crafted legislations to deal with disinformation. And we've seen internet shut down, and just last week was when they uplifted the ban on Twitter after 7 months in Nigeria. Now, what this also does is that it's not just suppressing rights, it also emboldens even disinformation purveyors to be much more creative and reactive, especially when you talk about the link between the offline and the online itself. And I think my final point will then go on to the role of social media platforms or tech platforms in general in terms of their response to disinformation. Responses most times are not balanced, while some platforms actually will even try to engage. You use Facebook as an example with civic actors. Others are completely non-responsive or not present in the country. Then the kind of attention that is also accorded Nigeria as a big country in Africa and in West Africa, the same will not be accorded to Cape Verde, which is actually a tiny island nation in West Africa as well. When there are fact checks ongoing, it doesn't actually look at the importance of local languages, which most of this information actually come through itself. Then there are lack of code of conduct, voluntary or regulatory framework, or even quick responses in terms of demoting content or algorithm itself. Put together, this actually makes the environment to become extraordinarily toxic, divisive, and driving towards the kind of unprecedented division that has not been seen in the recent past in most of the countries, not just in Nigeria, but across West Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Idayat, and thanks for giving such a clear walkthrough of disinformation and how easy it is to manipulate content and how cheap. And also for touching on the topic of emotions, which I'll definitely be coming back to later in our discussion. And for now, Branka, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks so much for the previous speakers. I think this brought the audience right into the topic. Maybe I will now actually take a step back and try to look at the big picture. We got a sort of a walk through very specific case of fake, like deep fakes, and then very specific example of Nigeria. I think it's very, very important for us to understand what is this challenge that we are actually facing. Because many people will say disinformation, misinformation, and we heard this from Idayat, it's not new, right? We as a society are dealing with this since we started communicating, basically. Many will say as long as we communicate as human beings, we will have this type of disinformation is something different. It's more like intentional and planned. And why I think it's important to emphasize this is a very different type of beast, let's say, that we have to deal with today. And I picked it from the introductory video that just like slightly mentioned this, like it's different by scale and speed. And I would like us to pause here because I think this is the crucial difference that we need to understand why this is a different problem we are tackling now. Exactly the speed in which fake news can flow and the scale in which it flows. And I also want us to remember this afterwards when we go into the discussion more in depth, when we start searching for who should solve this problem, right? Are we looking into ourselves as people who are reading information, those who are creating information, or maybe, as again, Idayat, thanks so much for mentioning this, like the role of tech platforms that I will try also to go more in depth with. How much of a threat this is, I thought this is really interesting. A lot of research has been done. I think we still have a long way to go to understand how big of a threat this is in quantitative terms. But I don't know if we will have a survey or something. It would be interesting to see what the audience is thinking about. I went to see the survey that was done last year with the, unfortunately, only the surveyed people in the US and Europe, just to see what people's perceptions are. And I was, as somebody who is working in this field, I was a bit surprised as well how big of a problem people see in this. And I will tell you the results from the survey. So people see that fake news are more of a threat than a terrorism itself. So this is the US audience and European audience. That it's almost as big as a threat than a climate change. And then a very specific question that I hope we will again come back to when we talk about the democracy. So audience in the US was asked and shared that in the US, 70% believe that it had a direct impact on the 2020 elections. So this is, I think, quite a big of a deal now. We see that people are realizing how big of a problem this is. And there are many different avenues in which we can have this conversation. I think because of the fact that we are at the Basel Peace Forum, we started talking about peace. We will talk a bit about democracy. Yesterday, somebody mentioned this, a sort of a new word, infodemic, right? We have a huge impact of fake news on our health system today. So COVID completely brought this new type of threat that we have to deal with. And the deep cause of a problem is very similar to what we are dealing with in the peace sector as well. So it's also important to have these cross conversations with other areas as well. Well, thinking about this topic, again, I think a lot has been done and shared and researched, but I really wanted to emphasize at least a couple of sentences on the two big names that I think changed a little bit the discussion in the 2021. And maybe some of you heard about this name of Frances Haugen, who is a Facebook whistleblower. So this is this change of a discourse that we have with a person for the first time who actually came from the inside of the big platform, sharing many things that researchers were saying for years. Now we have proof for this. So this person literally copied hundreds of pages of a discussion that different teams in Facebook were having and sharing exactly this, that Facebook is sharing, is spreading on scale the misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, that it's creating division in our society, even with different Facebook or Meta products, with Instagram harming our children. So this is something, a new momentum that we had and this witnessing in and talking in. Emma, tell me if I'm going over the time. I can talk a lot about it, especially when we start about the tech platforms. So I wanted also regarding this to mention this specific term that we are tackling with. Maybe some of you heard about this, clickbait farms. Like, what Frances Haugen again discovered is the scale not only of the problem that exists in these clickbait farms, but also the Facebook's implication in creating and financing these farms, and with this indirectly the disinformation as well. I would like us also to talk about algorithms per se. So this is this artificial intelligence part of the story. It's not only the fake news, it's not only the disinformation, it's not only what people share maliciously or sometimes not even knowing that they are sharing the fake news. It's also what is creating this scale effect and what is making this a completely new type of animal that we are facing today are algorithms that are amplifying this. Another number that was just shocking for me that I wanted to share with the audience is the fact that 64% of the time that a person joins an extremist Facebook group is because Facebook recommended this group. So I'll repeat this once again, 64% of the time. Those people were not searching for those groups. Those groups were recommended through the recommendation algorithm by Facebook. And just to make it clear, I'm not here to, no, I'm not attacking Facebook or anything. We can talk about different platforms and different social networks. There are really quite concerning data around the YouTube as well. YouTube is the second most visited website in the world. And let's bring another number here, that 71% of videos that are reported as harmful content were automatically recommended by the platform itself. So when researchers say harmful content, this is exactly what they mean. So misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, even call for violence. So my intention here is really to try to dedicate part of this conversation into looking into the role of platforms as well, and the role of algorithms that are powering these systems, and what is their role in creating the problem. And this will hopefully help us to find a solution or potential way for the solution as well. Maybe I'm over time. I had another name that I wanted to mention just quickly, because we are at the Basel Peace Forum, and I thought it would be very nice to make a connection with the Nobel Peace Prize. And maybe some of you followed who the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize were last year. 2 journalists actually got the reward, and I'm intentionally picking one for the conversation of fake news. So her name is Maria Ressa. She is Filipino. And she was actually for years trying to fight exactly these algorithms, bots, and clickbait farms. So if some of you are following the situation in Philippines as well, so she's the one who is criticizing the undemocratic regime of the President Duterte, and she's actually saying that she's running the war on 2 fronts. One front is Duterte and what his regime is creating in the country. The other are tech platforms, and specifically what Facebook is doing to spread the fake news and to actually, and those are her words, Facebook is killing our democracies. What has been done in Philippines, she was warning, and I think this is really important for those of us who are coming from developing countries, we are often used as test beds. These things are tested, trying to see how they can impact election processes, democracies. And then what we saw, what Maria Ressa was warning all of these years, just wait and see, you will see it in the US as well, and this is what happened. And this is why I wanted to use the couple of minutes to emphasize the 2 big names, big women. They don't need any emphasis, they're really giants, but I think it's really motivating also to look into their work and to see how we can learn from this and maybe have this conversation together on a broader scale here and even outside of the Basel Forum to see how we can potentially solve the problem. Thank you, Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Branka, so much to go on there. So I'm happy to go into our discussion now. And I have one question here in the chat, but just a reminder, anyone watching online, put your questions in, and soon we'll also have a microphone for those of you here who have questions. But I do want to start off with one question of my own, which is linking us to our theme today, which is emotions. And I think it's clear that misinformation and disinformation, they often capitalize on people's emotions by exploiting and amplifying prejudices and fears and encouraging polarization. So I'm just wondering what your comments are about, in your different contexts, how we can approach this very human state of heightened emotions when we're combating disinformation. And this is posed to the whole panel, so whoever wants to start first. Danielle, I see you nodding. Go ahead.
So what I think is always so starkly apparent to me is that as someone who comes from the US and where the major tech platforms are founded and the legal regime that governs it or doesn't govern it, is that the incentives for these platforms are, thanks to Section 230 of the Decency Act, means that they're not responsible for what people say and do on their platforms. And their business model, their incentives are the liking, the clicking, and sharing. And when Idayat, your comments were so powerful in thinking about the incentives of regimes, which is not to at all regulate within their own countries' tech platforms, because they are the beneficiaries of the liking, clicking, and sharing of those destructive, horrific, disinformation videos. And so the problem, I think, in part is because the rest of the world is governed by basically the U.S. and we're scofflaws, right? And the fact that the U.S. has no tech companies do not have an incentive to, they are not liable for what the liking and clicking and sharing and all the destruction. Regimes aren't motivated, especially, countries that are more vulnerable are not motivated to block or geo-block, right, destructive videos because it's in their interest to stir up that emotion, to stir up disinformation, right, and chaos. We have an incentives problem. And what I've experienced, so I've been working with Facebook and Twitter since 2009. So I'm on Twitter's Trust and Safety Task Force and working with Facebook on their non-consensual intimate imagery. And we've seen some important successes, right, with regard to non-consensual porn, and non-consensual intimate imagery. Where we haven't and where I've pressed is in particular around digitally manipulated videos and disinformation that's false, but it doesn't fall into one of their distinct categories. And it may be that it's like a cheap fake, not a real deep fake. We've seen some moves to ban, digitally manipulated video and audio. And the response I always get is, and we talk about countries where they don't have sufficient, this is Idayat was underscoring, countries that Facebook does not have sufficient terms of service, nor do they have content moderators to speak the language. So you have just chaos and disarray, and you don't have meaningful content moderation, and there's no incentive to do it, right, for these companies to internalize the costs they're externalizing. And so, we're left in a spot where when the U.S. activists who work with these companies say, look what's happening across the world, look what happened in Rwanda, right, the spread of disinformation that leads to, death and destruction, the response to me is we can't do it at scale. This goes back to Branka's original point. Like, what makes this different is scale and speed. Now, that's goddamn no excuse. I sort of say yes, but it's making you, the scale is making you a tremendous amount of money. And the response to me is, well, we can't fix this at scale, right? And that is just a not answer, right? We've seen the destruction across the globe and its impact on peace, its impact on democracy and truth and trust. And so it's incredibly frustrating, right, when I hear the word scale as if it's something glorious, right? It's scale that helps the tech platforms earn a tremendous amount of money, and it's scale of destruction. And it's an excuse, right? And because we don't have liability regimes, which I'm trying to work to fix, in the United States, it's externalizing the harm across the globe. Right, what happens in the U.S. and liability in the U.S. unfortunately serves regimes outside of the U.S. and has a destructive impact.
Thank you. Idayat, can I ask you to jump in here?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think first and foremost, we should start by saying that the incentives, the value for democracy at every point should actually be greater. Here, it's worth more than the utility. We still have to go back to democracy itself. What is the values? What are the government doing? What are they pushing? Are they bridging the grievances, the marginalization? And how is democracy going to deliver to the people such that even from the demand side, that's incentives to believe and to allow.
I was giving it a minute. I hope she comes back. Maybe Branka, while we're waiting for her video to load, I'll give you a chance to
Sure.
join.
And maybe turning off the camera will help.
Yes, Idayat, if you can hear us, maybe try turning the camera off, and then we'll. Oh, here, you're back. Okay, we'll come back to you in a second. You're back, Idayat. Go ahead and finish.
So
Yes, please.
important And here it is dependent on the state to do as much as possible to deliver it to the people, to bridge these narratives from growing. But secondly is the tech platforms themselves, the engagement, the rules of engagement for tech platform. Whichever way we say it, the global north, the global south is actually suffering at every point in time. You can talk about the EU and talk about the disinformation part. There is at least something that is working. Even in the US, people are coming forth. There is actually no incentive, and we need to start calling out this bad behavior more and more. And I give the instance of COVID. As it relates to COVID, on YouTube, which is not responsive in terms of demoting content, particularly when it comes to peace and security, even from extremist groups, constantly correct information. You find the same also on Facebook. Why is it that when it comes to disinformation that is polarizing the nation, that is confusing voters, nothing at all is actually being done at that point, and even the capacity to engage by actors and also missing, particularly when you see the civil society, because of third-party monitoring, they give groups who do not have monies in the developing nation, $30,000 US, $15,000 US, $50,000 US. When your grant base is so minimal, what will be the incentive to actually call out Facebook in this instance? Then, of course, to the immediate, I think where we talk really about not using influencers because of the disadvantages that it actually occasion most time. But I have a very positive experience going on ground and doing work. So of recent, I was actually working in a very conflict region, one of the most impacted, not even Boko Haram now, but the northwest of Nigeria, and speaking to people on the conflict dynamics. And one of the important things they actually mentioned was not just the role of fake news, but the need to actually use religious leaders in terms of countering fake news. And that as the panacea. But this again, then actually built right upon what we have found in our surveys, that most of these are actually, most of the disinformation that permits the policy are believed because it comes from influential sources. And when you read the use of WhatsApp in Nigeria elections, you find that in that report, so much reference was made to religious leaders. When people in the states we polled told they believed all forms of information they actually brought. So thinking out of the box, thinking of people who could actually be much more influential, and knowing that emphasis should not just be online, we also have to see how we deal with the offline such that it becomes a circle at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Idayat. Branka, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so many amazing points that we can pick up and go in details. Emma, I would just quickly go back to your initial maybe intro and question that you asked about the emotions, because I think that's a very important part of conversation that we are having around hate news, and how we are learning more and more things about ourselves as humans. So I'm just passing the words of, I don't know if there are any psychologists here in the audience. As psychologists, we also know how people function differently in groups. So what online spaces created is now a different type of behavior as well. And what we realized is actually that we are emotional, which is not something new for social media. It has different consequences, again, because of the business models of the tech platforms. But what is the fact is that the more emotional we are, the more we tend to reshare the content, right, or react to the content. And this is where the emotions are coming in place. We do that more often with fake news for some reason. Some psychologists would say because of this novelty, they call it a novelty mechanism, because fake news usually put something shocking and new and novel, and then humans immediately react on that. And this is an important thing, and this is why I'm glad that the forum is putting emotions in the center of the conversation, because this is what companies, tech platforms, social media figured out, not by chance. They have hundreds of psychologists employed in their offices, right, to try to hack the human nature. Why? Because they are earning money from this. And now to make a connection to what the previous speakers were telling about the scale, Danielle, I completely agree about this, and I love this. I wrote it down, like scale of destruction. Like we have a scale of spreading the fake news. It's creating a sort of a destruction. And then we hear the feedback from the tech companies, the solutions are not scalable. So what does that mean? What does, I don't know if, like, yes, like this scale, I think it's coming actually from the Silicon Valley and from all of this, you have to move fast and break things fast. So you have to succeed fast with not spending a lot of money. If you're tackling the problem on scale, you will solve it. So this is what they are saying. We can't solve it on scale, but it's not that it's not solvable. We have two pathways of solution for this problem. So one would be the moderation, and we can pick up some examples. I don't know if we have, I don't have the information about Nigeria. I know, for example, for Ethiopia, how many languages Ethiopia has, and how many languages is actually Facebook covering through moderation. So they are simply not employing people to work on this. So this is one solution with the human moderation. The other solution is what they are trying to do through, again, going back to algorithms, like training the algorithms, because the scale of spreading information is so big today that we as humans, it's just like too much work for people to handle this amount of information. So we are trying to employ algorithms, systems that can be trained to pick up quickly when hate speech is happening, or misinformation or disinformation. The problem is that algorithms cannot be trained. They can be trained to recognize the Holocaust discourse, for example, but that algorithm would not recognize the genocide in Myanmar. So that's the problem, that when they're saying it's not scalable, it can't be solved. But the solutions are absolutely out there. We just need to be more vocal and more insisting to actually create them.
That actually leads well into a question that has come into the chat. So I had asked our speakers to bring some questions for their fellow speakers, and I really do want to get to those, but since we have some questions coming in, I'm going to start here, and then I'll ask those here if there's more questions. So Fadi has asked, it kind of reminds me of what you're talking about. It's also directed towards you, Danielle, about deepfakes. Can technology be also part of the solution to finding it says how to localize and identify the sources or origins of fake information or deep fakes. So I think it's kind of, where can we find solutions with the technology and not just the challenges, or how can we do that? Danielle, do you want to start?
Sure. So technologists are working on digital provenance technologies. That is sort of, if you think of watermarks, that's a very crass way to think about it, but the technologies that have within provenance and that they can attest to the authenticity, right, of video and audio. Now, that is an important development, and I have, dear friends at Berkeley and USC are working on some of these authentication, like technologies of authentication and provenance. The problem is tech platforms don't require that these technologies be used on their platforms. And so when you don't have sort of gatekeepers saying what can and can't appear in the sense of like the particular kinds of technologies or video technologies that can be shared on platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, right? Then you can have on the market, you can offer on the market technologies of provenance and authenticity, but people have to use them and they have to be shared. And they've got to crowd out what people are looking at. And so, yes, there are moves that technologists are working really hard at. There's also folks working on the detection side, right? It's a cat and mouse game. And so the question is, as quickly as a digitally manipulated video and audio becomes sophisticated, there's a race for technology, race for the white hat folks to detect, right, that really sophisticated sort of new technologies. And it's a race, right? And so often I have to say the black hats are kind of one step ahead of the white hats, but sometimes that shifts and changes. And so it's not that I'm suggesting that there won't ever be a technical solution, though I sort of doubt that we'll ever end this race between the detection and the mischief. But nonetheless, unless we have gatekeepers enforce and require technologies of authentication, we're still going to be in the same spot that we're in. And we know that, the negative, the novel, of course, grabs us, but especially the negative, right? That is what plays on our emotions, is that it's negative, it's salacious, it hits us in the gut. And video and audio are visceral, right? They hit us in the gut, and we share them because they confirm our biases, right? They're salacious, they're negative, and they're novel. And so unfortunately, it's a tough nut to crack, because I always say this in my talks, we are the bug in the code, like human beings, right? And all of our our heuristics, right? And all of our biases make us the problem. But also, so too are the platforms that aren't incentivized to say, you can only use this kind of, authenticated video, right? You would have less content and less likes, clicks, and shares if they said that. I would love for them to voluntarily and self-regulate and say, we're only going to use authenticated, true pick kinds of technology, so to speak. They're not doing that, and they don't have incentives to do that. Law is not forcing them to internalize these negative externalities. And so that's my answer on the technical solutions. I'm down for all solutions. I'm one of those lawyers who are like, I'll take any tool in the toolbox. Technical ones are great. And I'd love to see the development, and we're seeing some folks working on it. But unless gatekeepers so require them, we're still going to be in the same spot.
May I connect this here quickly, because I think, Danielle, your work and what you're doing on deepfakes, it's just such a perfect example here of this question that we often ask, maybe the expectation as well, who should solve the problem, right? It's not only like which tool are we using from the toolbox, but quite often we see like who is expected to do this. And then we have this division between, are we as individuals responsible? And I think this is also a very important conversation to have. Are we spreading the hate speech or fake news too quickly, right? Are we too quick to click the reshare button? And that's, again, that emotional side of the story. So that's a very valid, I think, argument. There was one of the platforms, I think Facebook tested this, maybe it was even Twitter, when you want to reshare something that you didn't read, they actually prompt you, are you sure you didn't read this article? Like, do you really want to share it? I think it was quite a good reminder of, oh, wait, I really didn't, do I know what is out there? So this is one side of the story. The other one is the technology. And I completely agree with you, Daniela. And I think that's why I mentioned fake news as an example, not deepfakes, sorry, deepfakes is a perfect example, because a couple of years ago, we had these movements of training people how to recognize. It doesn't matter, Daniela, like shallow, it can be a shallow fake as well. It's much easier, I guess, but also like training people how to recognize deepfake. And I'm just thinking this is a lost battle. Like, some of these new technologies are so advanced, and they're being better and better in faking reality, that if the emphasis is on us to recognize this, we will lose the war. It's done. And that's why I think there are areas where we need to admit that we need the technology, we need the work, as Daniela and people like Hani Farid is another expert from Berkeley who is working on these technologies to help us to actually recognize, what is this video the deepfake or not? Because in certain situations, this deepfake video can decide if we will have war tomorrow or not. Or if our election process will be completely disrupted or not. So this is how big of a problem this is, and that's why I think that absolutely we need the technological solutions as well. And then on top of that, again, trying to engage the platforms, because they are the ones at the end who are deciding if they will apply the technological solutions in their networks.
Is there someone here in Basel who has a question they want to pose? Microphone's coming over.
Oliver Fink, University of Basel. As a psychologist and emotions researcher, so we have touched on this topic once or twice. And a term that we use occasionally is the term like emotional reality or psychological reality. And that can be powerful and useful or not. And I would like to ask if, you know, for example, if I as a conflict party feel suppressed, sidelined, left out, and I'm angry and I'm voicing that anger, although that is not the objective reality, is, you know, when am I crossing into fake news, or where would you draw, you know, the boundary towards fake news?
I'm happy to pick up on this. I don't think this is a fake news at all. I mean, expressing emotions and I think sharing through the dialogue is a very important part of the peace processes and peace dialogues, especially. Now, I don't know on which level we are talking about here. If we are talking about official negotiations, like there are different rules even now out there. Like when we start negotiating the peace contract, when we start sitting at the same table, the parties even now have the rules. You know, they have to put Facebook in the can you imagine that? Like these companies started being so strong. Like the power dynamics are just incredible. You would never say like 10 years ago that Facebook will have to go into the peace contract, into warring parties, right? So that's one thing. The other thing, or what they can tweet or post on Facebook during the conversation. The other thing are people, humans, communities. I really think this is still a part of our freedom of speech. And it's important to express things without going into hate speech or call for violence, right? And then even for people who are expressing, so this is why I'm trying it. I hope I'm getting my message out there just to make it clear that one thing is you saying something on the platform. The other thing is then the platform using this to make money from this by spreading this on scale and trying to get more clicks for the commercials that they are having there. So this is another part of the conversation that I think we need to have. But expressing emotions, I think this is an important part of the reconciliation and peace building processes.
I saw another question in the middle here.
Thank you. Emotions tend to be very diverse. Often, very strong emotions, exacerbated emotions, may tend to go towards disinformation, hate, strong feelings. Whereas there is another type of emotions which leads towards empathy and which is very, very useful in peace process. So in the media, is there a way to favor some type of emotions and try to mitigate the extreme emotions? So is there a way to segregate among the emotions to give more leeway to the positive ones, trying to play down the dangerous ones?
Idayat?
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll take the two questions together and try to contextualize it. So what's very important is that it's no limit, because most times we are talking fake news doesn't work in a vacuum. It actually builds on pre-existing narrative. People's lived reality and context do really matters. So these are three important parts. So if you say, oh, our community is being attacked today, because it's previously been attacked and there has been historical problems between Fulanis and Berom Christians, it becomes easy to actually believe any video that really emanates. because this is historical and this is actually lived in. And this is what is often instrumentalized in conflict and even in elections itself. Now, separating and going for one media against the other, maybe conventional media, it's also good to put it in context that these days, what comes on the conventional media is actually dictated by what happens on the social media. Because in different ways, they continue to look at the trends. So what is happening? What is actually being discussed online? What is discussed online finds its way into what is actually discussed on radios and TVs. It actually dictates, because again, it's not just only about who is forced to break the news, but who actually will have the most viewership. So supplanting something positive at the expense of something that will actually break the news, it's also an opportunity cost. And this is not outside also of media ownership also. Either you are talking in terms of government media, who will always work in support of the state, or we are also talking in terms of private media, who are actually thinking that what comes in on this other media. And when attempts are actually made to actually incorporate those emotive factors in, don't forget that because of the cost, those positive emotive messaging will only take 1 minute out of what we have actually discussed, when 30 minutes or 1 hour has been devoted to the raging issue of the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Idayat. We have only a couple minutes left, so I just want to offer a last chance for each of our speakers to maybe leave us with something that they didn't get to yet today, or some final words for us. Branka, can I start with you?
I can't believe you're already at the end of the panel.
I know.
It was such an interesting conversation. I would actually like to just refer to the last question and maybe use it as a closing word as well, because I think this is really a crucial thing as well, how to emphasize the positive, empathic conversations online. I think we had even the prompt about the role of journalists, like what is the role of peace builders? Like we have peace builders here in the audience, so I'm just like inviting us all as peace builders to see maybe what are some of the traditional roles that we were playing in the physical spaces, right? How we were bringing people together to talk with each other in the same room. We have to start thinking now, these conversations are happening, even before COVID, are happening more and more in the digital spaces. Like what are some of the lessons that we have, some of the tools, some of the methods that we can maybe use in digital spaces. And I actually have an example of an organization who is doing really interesting work and cooperating with platforms called Moonshot CVE. So they're trying, instead of this cancel culture with extremist behavior online, you know, when you basically move away somebody from the platform and basically just put them on, how do you say, below the earth, right? to continue doing the things over and over again. They're basically engaging, so redirecting the conversation from the extremist behavior and then offering alternative resources. So not what YouTube was doing, giving you, if you search for an extremist or something that leads you to an extremist content, YouTube would offer more of these type of contents to hook you, right? To keep you more, to keep your attention. So these methods are actually doing what we were doing in the physical spaces, offering alternative contents, offering alternative discussions, even offering sometimes psychological, you know, certain resources, offering these type of groups. So absolutely, these type of things exist out there. I think we just need to be more vocal and more persistent in applying them, and ultimately really demanding from these platforms. They are not applying these methods because they don't bring them money. Like they are, at the end, they are businesses, and their priority is profit. So we need to put people over profit, not profit over people.
Thank you. Danielle, and if I can ask you to keep your final statements a little bit short since we're a little bit over time.
Of course. So we often think that platforms can solve everything. And I think the notion that we can redirect and engage in counter speech is such an important one. And we've seen, YouTube and Yasmin Green sort of do that work. The problem is sometimes when, the questioner asks, like, what's the difference between what's fake and what's real? How can we tell what's fake news? There's some kinds of speech that are simply unanswerable. And so we can redirect all we want, but you can't really answer a fake sex video, right? And so we, I think, have to think about, and Idayat talked about the video of decapitated children and burning homes. Like, some things are just simply, it seems unanswerable in many ways because of the way we emotionally react to them. So this is all a very hard problem. I'm so happy to have been included in the conversation. Thank you so much for such an illuminating panel and wonderful panelists.
Thank you, Danielle. And Idayat, any short last words?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we focus so much on platform response, but we need to start thinking more how to engender even a cross-platform response to addressing disinformation. Noting that platforms do not actually operate in silos. When conversations are ongoing on clubhouses, the same are at times live tweeted on Twitter. When we post on Facebook, it's actually shared on WhatsApp, YouTube, and even up to Telegram. But when there are responses, most of these responses are in silos. So there is a need to engender a cross-platform responses. And while also doing this, we have to also emphasize that in all these responses, there is actually a difference, a challenge between the North and the South. And there is a need to actually emphasize for a minimum standard of response by platform in the Global South to addressing disinformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Idayat, Danielle, and Branka. It was such an interesting conversation. I have many more questions. I know the audience does, so I recommend that you find each other in the coffee area or online. We're 5 minutes over, so I'm going to end it here. But thank you so much to everyone who joined us, the audience and our speakers, and I look forward to seeing you at the rest of the Basel Peace Forum events.